Thank you, George, and good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to our Spotlight session this afternoon on tobacco. I'm Gail Hurley. I'm a Senior Advisor with the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, and I'm your moderator for this session. I'm also supporting the work of Tobacco-Free Portfolios, one of our featured guests today, and I'm delighted that the topic of tobacco is on the agenda of this year's Ethical Finance Summit. It's an important issue in the ethical finance debate, but it's not really been in the spotlight recently in the cacophony of noise around COP26 and the race to net zero. And we've seen on the back of that a flurry of announcements and commitments from financial sector actors on decarbonising their portfolios. All that's wonderful, but we haven't heard too much about tobacco of late. So our aim is to redress that very much today with this spotlight session. And I'm pleased to be joined by two amazing experts in this field. Dr Bronwyn King, who's founder and CEO of Tobacco-Free Portfolios, who's joining us from Melbourne, Australia today. Good evening to you, Bronwyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail.
And Mr. Ruben Zandvliet, who's Environmental, Social and Ethical Risk Advisor with ABN AMRO Bank in the Netherlands. Ruben, a warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you, Gail.
Before we start, and by way of disclosure, I should probably add that this is also a topic that's very dear to my heart, having spent some time in Zambia a couple of years ago working with tobacco farmers and looking at the ways we could use new innovations in finance like social impact bonds to support economic diversification programs there. So I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation today. So Bronwyn, perhaps I can turn to you first, ladies first. You're probably, it's fair to say, the global champion of tobacco-free finance worldwide. You're the founder of Tobacco-Free Portfolios. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about why you started the organisation and what you hope to achieve.
Thanks so much, Gail. Yes, when you say, I'm the global champion, I actually like to think that my patients are. And that's really where the story comes from, because I'm a radiation oncologist by background. And in my early years of medicine, I saw the true impact of tobacco. And while I know everybody knows that tobacco is bad, it was really having a front seat at the actual show of tobacco, and it's an absolutely devastating reality where I just watch so many of my patients go through terrible suffering. Many of them die, and it was an accidental discovery 10 years later where I found out that, in fact, through my compulsory pension plan in Australia, I was investing in big tobacco. And right away at that exact moment, I felt that there was a conversation missing. It was missing between the health sector and the finance sector. And I felt that if people in finance sat down and really learnt a bit more about tobacco, that they would be motivated and would feel compelled, like I was, to do something about it and to go tobacco free. So the work really started here in Australia with our big pension plans here. And as you know, and the audience will know, Australia has a very big pension sector, the fourth biggest pension sector in the world. And after some pretty tough conversations back in 2010, 11, 12, we saw some movement where some of the biggest pension plans did go tobacco free across all of their offerings. And that was pretty instrumental, because prior to that, it had only been maybe a few very small boutique organisations or some religious institutions, financial institutions, that had exclusions. But suddenly in Australia in 2012, 13, 14, we started to see this growing acceptance that having exclusions made sense. Now, overwhelmingly, the superannuation or pension sector in Australia is tobacco free, and it was a great case study to share with the world. So in 2015, we started working all across the globe. We were very pleased to spend a lot of time in Europe and made a lot of progress there. In Europe, people in finance wanted to talk about this issue and started putting those exclusions in place and really joining together with the global health sector and communities and governments and parents and teachers in wanting to bring an end to what is called in the health world the global tobacco epidemic. And just to give a number there, the World Health Organization predicts that the world is going to see 1 billion tobacco-related deaths this century. So it's a really extraordinary problem and does require global collaboration across sectors, across borders, so that we can comprehensively do something about it. So that's where the work has sort of come from. And I don't know if I have time now to mention, but our flagship initiative is called the Pledge, the Tobacco-Free Finance Pledge, and we were very pleased to launch that at the United Nations in 2018. We had the support of President Macron, we had the support of the Australian Prime Minister Turnbull, we had the support of 3 different UN agencies. The World Health Organization got behind it. Dr Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General, he came along and spoke at the launch. And we're thrilled that this has become an initiative, and we're seeing more and more major financial institutions signing up. There's now almost 170 financial institutions signed up from more than 20 countries, and together they control more than $11.5 trillion US. And I'm very happy to say ABN AMRO is one of our proudest signatories. So we've been very pleased to work with them for some time.
Thank you. That's excellent, Bronwyn. And it sounds like the work is really gaining in momentum over recent years. So congratulations. Well, I mean, I was about to ask that very question to you, Ruben, with ABN AMRO. I mean, you're in charge of environmental, social and ethical risk. So I wondered, is ABN AMRO tobacco free? And in fact, what does the conversation look like on tobacco exclusions in ABN AMRO?
Yeah, thanks, Gail. Yeah, ABN AMRO is tobacco free, and I think we started that process sometime in 2016 through engagement with the Dutch Heart Foundation and other public health NGOs in the Netherlands who roll out our vision for a smoke-free generation. So in 2017, we decided to exclude tobacco from all lending activities, and in 2018, we excluded tobacco from all investment activities. So across the board in all lending and investment activities of the bank, we are tobacco free, and that's because, and that's also the time, 2018, when we could, of course, join the tobacco-free finance pledge.
And was it a difficult conversation internally to have within the bank, or was the process fairly smooth, both in going tobacco-free as well as signing up to the pledge?
Well, signing up to the pledge was a step we took after we've made the decision to go tobacco-free on our lending and investment activities. So that really wasn't a conversation at all, I would say. There was a bit more conversation around the initial step to exclude tobacco from our lending services, but it logically followed from our engagement with the public health NGOs in the Netherlands, but also our commitment to human rights. So ABN AMRO for a longer time has really committed to respect human rights in line with the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights adopted in 2011. They provide a framework for companies to understand what they should do to address human rights risks in their own activities or associated with their business relationships. And when you start analyzing these issues through the lens of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, the right to the highest attainable standard of health is incorporated, is embedded in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Right? It is a human right, so companies must respect it. And once you start analyzing that, and you would recognize that through relationships with tobacco companies, you are in fact directly linked to that problem, and there's no way out. There's no way to successfully engage with tobacco companies. There's simply one solution left, and that's to exclude it across the board.
No, thanks, Ruben. I wanted to discuss a couple of areas that could perhaps be described very much as hot topics today in the ethical finance debate. So, Bronwyn, if I could turn to you first. I mean, the title of our session today is the S in ESG and why it matters. And certainly we've heard an awful lot recently around environmental concerns and climate change related concerns. So the E part has very much dominated the ethical finance debate, but it's also the case that the COVID-19 pandemic has unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, shining a renewed spotlight on social risk, and is leading us to think, more closely about the impact that businesses have on their workforce, on local communities. I mean, what impact do you think that renewed interest in the social part might have on how we view tobacco companies and investments in tobacco companies?
Well, look, I think that the whole COVID crisis has created a huge uplift in interest around sustainability, full stop. So I think that is a great thing, and I think that more awareness of environmental and governance risks and how they relate to investments also is a great thing. But it has indeed provided this really interesting point in time where I think that really almost for the first time ever, the finance sector has suddenly got a big jolt and realised that health is intrinsically important when we look at the impact of companies on the world. It's not just the impact on the environment or on, for example, health and safety of employees, or how many women are on boards, or how diverse boards are. There is, in fact, this fundamental principle of health, which I think up until now has pretty much been missed. So even if we look right now, there's more than 600 different ESG and ratings out there. And we have actually found that tobacco companies have really gamed that system very effectively, because while they may score well on a whole range of metrics, the fact that they make products that killed an estimated 8 million people in 2020 doesn't seem to be captured anywhere, which is obviously a glaring gap in those systems. And if we just look at the numbers, the whole world stopped for COVID, and rightly so. COVID tragically took 1.8 million lives in 2020, yet in the very same year, tobacco had the worst impact ever on humanity, taking 8 million lives, so 4 times the number. And of those 8 million people, 1.2 million people don't even smoke. So that just sort of shows, this extra layer of impact, not just on a customer, but on the community in general. So we certainly hope that when people are scrutinising ESG methodologies, they're really, being sceptical, looking very deep down, and making sure that what is said on the label of a product really is a reflection of what they expect.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of ESG methodologies and ESG frameworks, and I'd like to ask Ruben to pick up on that point, actually, because, we've seen a real uptick in investor interest, in consumer interest in products that are marketed as sustainable or SDG friendly or Paris aligned in some way, and now a dizzying array of financial products out there that are marketed in this way. It's a little bit of a Wild West out there, perhaps. So, I mean, how, in your view, Ruben, should ESG frameworks tackle tobacco? And can a tobacco company be sustainable, in your view?
Yeah, this is a very important issue, if not a key issue in the whole debate around finance and tobacco. Because tobacco companies cannot be sustainable, and ESG rating agencies really fail to capture that. And as you said, we cannot overestimate the role that ESG rating agencies, ESG data providers, as we call them, play. But they really fail to capture that. And demand for their services is booming, right? As sustainability gets higher on the agenda of the financial sector, due to increased consumer demand, but also due to increased regulation, the sustainable finance regulations that are rolled out in the European Union. And there are some real fundamental problems. So that's why recently the European Securities and Markets Authority has sent a letter to the European Commission warning for the unregulated and unsupervised nature of the market for ESG ratings and ESG assessment tools. And similar calls have been made by the Dutch and the French financial markets regulators. So there are a few problems. We see very low correlation between ratings. So for one rating agency, a company may be a leader on their confidential methodology, but for another data provider, the same company may be called a laggard. based on their own proprietary confidential methodology. And there's no transparency, there's no scrutiny from organizations, including public health organizations that should be able to see and review and comment on those methodologies. But we should also understand that many of these ESG risk scores really look at risk to investors. So how does poor management of ESG issues by the company translate into financial risk for investors? And that is an important question. It is a question that investors should answer. But it is not the only question that companies are supposed to answer under the UN Guiding Principles, which has a lens on impact to people. So some ESG rating agencies also try to capture that and make an assessment on what the impact of certain business activities is on people. But very remarkably, also in those outcomes, we see that it fails to adequately capture the health impacts of tobacco.
Bronwyn, did you want to come in on this point? What's tobacco-free portfolios doing in this area on ESG methodologies? I mean, what deficiencies do you see?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's just, I mean, there's so many, I think our job is really to make people aware of these gaps and the fact that you know these gaps exist and that an intense level of scrutiny is required because unfortunately many products labelled ESG do have tobacco in them. We're seeing many major organisations, as you mentioned, commit to all of these really great initiatives like net zero, yet they still have tobacco in their portfolios, and I suspect they're just unaware of how that's sort of slipping through a methodology that would otherwise be, I think, reasonably assumed to exclude tobacco. But Ruben mentioned several times, he's mentioned the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And I think when we look at that, it's such a great tool, and it relies on these three principles of protect, respect and remedy. And when it comes to the remedy, you know, I'll never forget being at a conference in Geneva for the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and asking about, you know, what's happening with remedy and the tobacco industry. So, for example, if we look at the impact on humanity in 2020, what's happened to those 8 million people who died? What's happened to their families? Where's the remedy going on? And of course, there was just silence at this conference because there's nothing happening there. There is no remedy. There's nothing. There's no compensation. There is, and even worse, there's no further prevention that this isn't just going to continue going on and on and on. In 2017, the Danish Institute of Human Rights used the UN Guiding Principles to assess the human rights impact of one of the world's biggest tobacco companies. And they came out and said, according to those UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, that this company, it was just irreconcilable. The production and marketing of tobacco was irreconcilable with the human right to life and the human right to health. And they recommended they immediately cease production and marketing of tobacco. Now, of course, that company didn't do that. They're continuing their business today. And I think that this just shows that it's almost like overarching ESG. We need some basic principles. And if your company is not adhering to basic human rights, if your company is making products that contribute directly to the death of consumers and others in the community, then I think we have a problem and we need to rethink these frameworks.
And Bronwyn, tell us, we're seeing many tobacco companies now diversify their product range and move into e-cigarettes or other supposedly less harmful products. What is your view about those? Are they better? And I suppose to Ruben as well, you know, should the financial sector be investing in those instead? Are these positive developments?
I think that overwhelmingly the health sector is extremely concerned about e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. We know for sure that they're addicting a new generation to nicotine. We know for sure that there is a gateway effect where children and teenagers who were otherwise not destined to smoke are now addicted to those products and more likely to start smoking old-fashioned cigarettes. We're also concerned about re-glamorising of the act of smoking, something that has sort of become the buzzword in tobacco control is denormalise. We've done very well to denormalise the act of smoking in many, many places, many countries and many settings throughout the world. So overall, we're very concerned about not just the short-term but the long-term impacts of these products. We're concerned about the way that there has been a massive uptake in children and teenagers, and I know many parents of teenagers who are desperately concerned about how kids, it seems all over the world, have increasingly become hooked to these products when there's no long-term data showing that they're safe at all, and there's very significant health concerns.
Yeah, we fully agree. I think sort of marketing on these products is also primarily geared towards Western societies where smoking has really been denormalized. Like, it is not the approach across the board in many developing countries. And for all the reasons that Bronwyn stated, I think financial institutions should not buy this. ABN AMRO will certainly not change its policies or its non-enforcement strategy. We know that this trend or this approach of the tobacco industry is not just a tool towards consumers, right? It's also a tool towards investors. They try to use this to create like benchmarks to distinguish responsible tobacco companies from slightly less responsible tobacco companies. But it is all marketing and PR based on a number of very, very flawed assumptions. So investors and banks should really not buy these types of benchmarks and stick to exclusion policies.
No, thanks to both. And I know that similar with traditional tobacco products, e-cigarettes and other new products are also associated with significant environmental waste as well. And I wanted to perhaps turn the discussion now onto the environment. Climate change is the topic of this year's Global Ethical Finance Summit. Of course, it's a big issue with COP26 happening just down the road from us in Glasgow in November 2021. And of course, we've seen over the last year, as I mentioned, many finance sector actors make commitments around decarbonising their investment portfolios over the next 2 decades. All of that is wonderful. Tobacco is not really part of that conversation, but should it be, in your view?
Well, certainly in mine, absolutely. I think that, many people are genuinely shocked when they find out that the #1 ocean plastic is cigarette filters. Filters turn into microplastics, so they're not visible. So we're not nearly as aware of that form of plastic compared to plastic bottles or bags or straws. But microplastics enter the food chain and end up, again, having a terrible impact on the environment and on human health. Even if you look at other metrics like deforestation, 5% is the estimated impact. 5% of global deforestation is caused by big tobacco, and that's really just a handful of companies, which is an extraordinary impact for really such a sector that really contributes no good to the world, certainly not in my view. And if you're looking at carbon emissions, so there were some interesting estimates recently that compared the carbon emissions that big tobacco contributes to the world, and they suggest that they're about the same as entire countries. So, for example, about the same as Israel or about the same as Peru. So if we just look at those as just some very basic metrics, going tobacco-free is entirely consistent with any other environmental initiative out there. And we certainly hope that while investors are considering big game-changing environmental commitments, that tobacco-free is on the table at the same time.
Yeah, and it can be the first thing that is on the table, right? So for some sectors, for the energy sector, which of course has a major responsibility to decarbonize and contribute to a net zero economy. I understand that there is a transition path, and we can debate sort of the speed of that transition and the contributions they would have to make. But they can play a role in that transition. For tobacco companies, like it's the low-hanging fruit for financial institutions. They can implement exclusion policies tomorrow, through that contribute to that net zero ambition, contribute to realization of the SDGs, fulfill their responsibility under the UN guiding principles, and there's no transition discussion in this sector whatsoever, at least not from my perspective.
No, thanks to both, and certainly, you know, that reinforces what I saw from my own work in Zambia a couple of years ago. So I saw how tobacco farmers have a lot of additional labour and environmental costs associated with what they do that they're not compensated for. So, for example, they have to build their own tobacco curing sheds, so they then have to go out to the forest and cut down the trees in order to build the fires that they need to cure those tobacco leaves. So you have scarce agricultural land being used for a crop where there's no nutritional value in a food insecure country, and you also have to destroy additional land in order to produce that crop as well. So, you know, I think a lot of these challenges are not widely understood, I think, by the financial sector. I wanted to, did one of you want to come in there? I wanted to, I read an article recently in the press about how there's an ongoing court case at the High Court in London relating to the alleged exploitation of tobacco farmers in Malawi. And Malawi, of course, is one of Scotland's international development partner countries. So given all of these concerns around tobacco farming, and given all of these concerns around public health, given all these concerns around sort of the regulatory pressures, the tightening pressures around regulation that we're seeing governments implement worldwide, I'm just wondering, Ruben, from your point of view, what do you think might be the continued appeal of investing in tobacco? Do they make financial sense purely from a financial point of view?
I don't know. I'm sure there are studies that suggest it would have a financial impact. I also think there are studies that show that divestment from tobacco does not have a significant financial impact on investment portfolios. But is it the first question you want to answer as a financial institution, right? Because it is one perspective to look at the issue, but the other perspective, the perspective of the UN guiding principles, the impact on people's health, on their life, basically, to me, that's a much more fundamental question. And whatever the outcome of the financial analysis would be, I think the second question is what financial institutions should really answer. And after we've signed the tobacco-free finance pledge, we have organized a roundtable, for example, at ABN AMRO with financial institutions that had not taken the step to become tobacco-free. And surely, you know, these issues are discussed, the financial impact on portfolios. But in the end, many recognize sort of the ethical question or the responsibility question that is sort of the main thing that financial institutions would have to focus on. And luckily, these roundtables work, right? So after our session, a number of the participants of their institutions became tobacco-free. And that would also be my main advice to financial institutions that consider becoming tobacco-free, right? Reach out to civil society, to public health NGOs, to tobacco-free portfolios, but also to peer financial institutions that have taken that step already.
And I think, can I jump in there and say there is some good news, though, on the finance front that I think is important for people to be aware of, which is that all of those financial risks that we've mentioned today, they have all converged. And in 2017, that's really when we saw the peak of tobacco share prices. And since then, there's been a very dramatic decline that has really departed from the rest of the index. If you have a look, for example, compared to the S&P 500, the S&P Tobacco Index has had a dramatic decline, such that today many tobacco companies are trading at just about 50% of the share price compared to 4 years ago. And the reasons behind that are all still present. The risks are still present and in fact intensifying. So it's not as if we expect some kind of change in the future. The regulations are getting tighter, the litigation risks are pressing, supply chains are being scrutinised, environmental risks are becoming more known, and there's a reputation risk that it just can never be changed. So it's also great to hear some recent reports. So, for example, CalPERS reported in 2020 that, in fact, their tobacco exclusion had led them to be $856 million better off just in the past 4 years. Australian super is 100 million Australian dollars better off. ABP is 700 million euro better off. So we've seen consistent and constant updates on how, in fact, financial institutions have been doing better. So I think that absolutely you can take a very strong ethical position, but also if you really carefully analyse the financial risks, I think that many financial institutions will feel quite comfortable that it is also a very prudent financial decision to go tobacco-free.
No, thanks to both. And there are certainly some very powerful arguments there in favour of implementing tobacco exclusions. And I think, we're only likely to see continued momentum around and interest around investing more sustainably and ethically in the future. Certainly it's a market which is moving incredibly fast and is becoming increasingly mainstream. So there's an offer there from Ruben and Bronwyn here. If you're interested in what it looks like and what it involves in terms of going tobacco free, and you want your questions answered, then I'm sure they will be happy to answer any questions you may have. I think we're out of time today, but I'd like to thank you both for your time and for your insights at this spotlight session on tobacco today. We did discuss the environmental and climate change side. We didn't totally avoid COP26. That's certainly difficult to do this year in Scotland. But as we said, tobacco cuts across all of these issues, doesn't it? But it's great that we were able to discuss such an important topic. So let me thank you both. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And thank you to the wonderful team at the Global Ethical Finance Initiative for another phenomenal ethical finance summit this year. And we very much look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. Thank you from me. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.